The words hung in the air like a verdict that couldn't be taken back, and standing there in the center of his sprawling living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, billionaire Marcus Thornton looked directly at the young woman who had cared for his children for the past 8 months and said it again, slower this time, as if she hadn't understood the first time. "You're fired, and I need you gone by tonight." And the nanny, a 26-year-old woman named Elena, who had moved across the country for this job, felt her knees buckle as tears streamed down her face, her hands still trembling from whatever had happened just hours before, and in the corner of the room sat a large German shepherd named Duke, his fur matted with dirt and debris, his breathing still heavy, watching the scene unfold with those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets nobody in that room could yet understand, and the 2 children, a 5-year-old girl named Sophie and her 7-year-old brother Ethan, stood frozen near the staircase, their small faces twisted with confusion as they looked back and forth between their father, their nanny, and their beloved dog, not understanding why everyone seemed so upset, why there was broken glass in the kitchen, why Duke had scratches on his paws, or why their father looked angrier than they had ever seen him, and in that moment, with tension thick enough to cut through, nobody in that house knew the truth yet, nobody knew what the security cameras had actually captured, and nobody could have predicted that by the end of that night, everything Marcus Thornton believed about judgment, loyalty, and trust would be completely shattered. But to understand how they all arrived at this devastating moment, we need to go back to before the chaos, back to when things still made sense, because this story isn't really about a billionaire or a nanny or even about blame. This story is about a dog who did something extraordinary and the humans who almost missed it entirely. Marcus Thornton had built his empire from nothing, starting with a small tech startup in a garage in Seattle and transforming it into one of the most successful software companies in the world, and somewhere along that journey of 18-hour workdays and billion-dollar deals, his marriage had quietly crumbled, leaving him as a single father to 2 young children who needed more attention than his schedule could possibly allow. So he did what any practical businessman would do: he hired help. Lots of it: housekeepers, drivers, personal assistants, and most importantly, a full-time nanny who could provide stability when he couldn't be there. And Elena had seemed perfect from the start, with glowing references, a degree in early childhood education, and a warmth about her that made Sophie and Ethan light up whenever she walked into a room. But here's the thing about Marcus: success had shaped him in very specific ways. He was decisive to a fault, quick to judge situations based on observable evidence, and deeply reliant on systems, structures, and technology to tell him what was true. His home was equipped with state-of-the-art security cameras, motion sensors, smart locks, and monitoring systems that could alert him to anything unusual from anywhere in the world. And while he trusted these systems completely, trusting people was another matter entirely. He had been burned too many times. By business partners, by his ex-wife, by people who smiled to his face and schemed behind his back. So he watched, he monitored, he kept emotional distance even from those who worked closest to his family. And then there was Duke, a 3-year-old German shepherd who had been a gift from a business associate 2 years prior. Marcus had never been particularly attached to the dog, viewing Duke more as an additional security measure than a family member, but the children adored him. Sophie would fall asleep curled against Duke's warm body, and Ethan would spend hours throwing tennis balls in the backyard while Duke bounded after them with tireless enthusiasm. Elena had noticed something special about Duke from her very first week: the way he would position himself between the children and unfamiliar visitors, the way his ears would perk up at sounds no human could detect, the way he seemed to sense mood shifts before anyone spoke a word. She had mentioned it to Marcus once, said something about Duke having incredible protective instincts, but Marcus had barely looked up from his phone, muttered something about dogs being dogs, and moved on to his next meeting. And that dismissal, that small moment of disregard, would haunt him later in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday. Marcus was in New York for a series of investor meetings. Elena had the children at home following their usual routine of breakfast, homeschool lessons, outdoor play, and afternoon quiet time, and Duke was doing what Duke always did, following the kids from room to room, lying in doorways where he could watch them, existing in that calm but alert state that working dogs seem to naturally maintain. It was around 2 in the afternoon when Elena first noticed Duke acting strangely. He had been napping in a patch of sunlight near the back door, but suddenly he was on his feet, ears forward, body rigid, staring intently at something beyond the glass. Elena called his name but he didn't respond. didn't even flick an ear in her direction, and then he started barking, not his usual alert bark when the mailman arrived, but something deeper, more urgent, almost frantic. Elena felt her stomach tighten because in 8 months she had never heard Duke sound like that. She quickly moved towards Sophie, who was coloring at the kitchen table, and Ethan, who was building Legos on the family room floor, and that's when everything happened at once. Duke charged toward the back door with such force that Elena screamed. There was a tremendous crash of shattering glass, furniture scraped across the floor, Sophie started crying, Ethan shouted for Duke, and Elena grabbed both children and pulled them toward the front of the house, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She didn't know what was happening, couldn't process the chaos. All she knew was that she needed to keep these kids safe, and something was very, very wrong. She managed to call 911 first, then called Marcus directly, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form words, and when she tried to explain what happened, she realized she didn't actually know. She just kept saying something triggered Duke. Something made him break through the door. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. 3 hours later, Marcus's private jet touched down and a car rushed him directly home, and what he found when he walked through the front door confirmed every fear his imagination had conjured during that endless flight. The back glass door was completely shattered, a heavy patio chair had been knocked over, there were muddy paw prints and what looked like small drops of blood trailing across the kitchen floor. Sophie was clinging to Elena's leg, still sniffling. Ethan was sitting on the couch looking shell-shocked, and Duke was lying in the corner, covered in dirt and debris, panting heavily, his paws scratched up from the broken glass, and Marcus felt something snap inside him. 8 months of trusting this woman with his children, 8 months of believing his home was secure, and this is what happened the moment he left town. He didn't yell at first. His voice was actually terrifyingly calm when he asked Elena to explain exactly what happened, and she tried, she really did. But her explanation sounded chaotic and confused. She kept saying Duke sent something, Duke was trying to protect them, Duke broke the door on purpose, but she couldn't explain what Duke was protecting them from. She hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anything unusual before Duke's reaction, and to Marcus, her story sounded exactly like what happens when someone panics and loses control of a situation. He saw a broken door, injured dog, traumatized children, and a nanny who couldn't provide a clear account of events. In his world, when you can't explain your failures, you take responsibility for them, and when someone fails to protect what matters most, they face consequences. So he made a decision the same way he made every decision, quickly and decisively, and that's how we arrived at the moment this story began, with Marcus standing in his living room telling Elena she was fired while she sobbed that she didn't do anything wrong, while Duke watched silently from the corner, while 2 confused children wondered why their whole world suddenly felt upside down. That night, after Elena had packed her belongings and left in tears, after the children had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, after the house fell into that heavy silence that follows crisis, Marcus poured himself a whiskey and retreated to his home office. He told himself he was just going to review the security footage for insurance purposes, to document the damage, maybe to see if there was any evidence of what had triggered the chaos so he could prevent it from happening again. But deep down, something was bothering him. Elena's insistence that Duke had acted protectively rather than aggressively, the way she kept saying he knew something was wrong, it didn't sit right, and Marcus hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by ignoring the things that didn't sit right. So he pulled up the footage from the back door camera and pressed play, and at first it looked exactly like he expected, chaotic, confusing, a blur of motion and shattering glass. But then he did something he rarely had patience for. He slowed it down, frame by frame, watching each second unfold in forensic detail, and that's when he saw it. That's when everything changed. 23 seconds before the chaos erupted, Duke's head lifted from his resting position, his ears rotated toward something beyond the camera's view, his body transitioned from relaxed to rigid in the span of a single heartbeat. And Marcus leaned closer to his monitor because Duke wasn't looking at nothing, Duke was tracking something. And then Marcus switched to the outdoor camera that covered the back fence line, and his blood went cold. There, partially obscured by the hedge, was a figure, a man dressed in dark clothing, moving along the fence toward the point where it connected to the house, and Marcus watched as the man tested the back gate, found it locked, then began climbing over. In the main footage, this was the exact moment Duke exploded into action, the exact moment he launched himself toward the back door with such force that he shattered the glass, and now Marcus could see it wasn't chaos, it wasn't aggression, it was intervention. Duke burst through that door and charged directly at the intruder with such ferocity that the man fell backward off the fence, scrambled to his feet, and ran, disappeared into the neighboring property while Duke barked and barked and barked. And inside the house, Elena wasn't panicking. She was doing exactly what she should have been doing. Marcus switched to the interior kitchen camera and watched her grab Sophie with one arm and reach for Ethan with the other, pulling both children away from the back of the house, positioning herself between them and whatever threat might come through that broken door. And Duke, once the intruder fled, turned and ran back into the house, back to the children, positioning himself in front of them while Elena called 911, and Marcus paused the footage on that image, Duke standing guard, Elena holding both kids behind him, and he felt something crack open inside his chest, because he had watched this scene before, hours earlier, but he had interpreted it completely differently. He had seen a panicked nanny who let things spiral out of control, but the truth was that a stranger had tried to enter his home while his children were inside, and the only reason that stranger didn't succeed was because of a dog he had barely paid attention to and a nanny he had just fired without letting her finish a sentence. Marcus sat in the darkness of his office for a long time, replaying the footage over and over, watching the moment Duke's instincts kicked in, watching him sacrifice his own safety by crashing through glass to reach a threat before it could reach the children, and with each replay, the weight on Marcus's chest grew heavier. He thought about all the times he had ignored Duke, treated him as background noise, scolded him for barking at visitors, dismissed Elena's observations about his protective nature, and he thought about the nanny he had just humiliated and fired, the young woman who had kept his children calm and safe during a terrifying situation and then been blamed for it, and the hardest part, the part that made him set down his whiskey and put his head in his hands, was realizing that he had done exactly what he always did. He had made a fast judgment based on incomplete information. He had trusted his assumptions over the people in front of him. He had valued his own certainty more than the truth, and this time, his certainty had been completely wrong. He had fired the wrong person and failed to recognize the real hero, a hero who was currently sleeping on a dog bed in the laundry room with bandaged paws and a coat still dirty from the chaos of protecting the people he loved. And somewhere across the city, Elena was probably crying herself to sleep, wondering what she had done wrong, carrying the weight of an accusation she didn't deserve. And Marcus whispered into the empty room, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't in years, "I got it wrong. I got it all wrong." The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn, having barely slept, and the first thing he did was walk to the laundry room where Duke was resting, and he knelt down on the cold tile floor, something he couldn't remember ever doing before, and Duke lifted his head, those deep brown eyes meeting Marcus's, and there was no resentment there, no grudge, no demand for apology, just the same steady loyalty that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. And Marcus reached out slowly and placed his hand on Duke's head, feeling the warmth of him, the solidity of his presence, and he said quietly, "Thank you, I'm sorry I didn't see you, but I see you now." And Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, and that small gesture broke something loose in Marcus's chest, made his eyes sting in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And later that morning, when Sophie and Ethan came downstairs, they found their father sitting on the floor with Duke, both children's faces lighting up as they ran to join the pile, small arms wrapping around the dog who had saved them from a danger they would never fully understand. And in that moment, surrounded by his children and this remarkable animal, Marcus made a decision, a slower decision than he usually made, one that required humility instead of certainty. He called Elena that afternoon, and when she answered, her voice was hoarse from crying, guarded, clearly expecting more accusations, but instead Marcus said something he hadn't said to anyone in years. He said, "I was wrong. I watched the footage properly, I saw everything, I saw what Duke did and I saw what you did, and I was completely wrong to blame you. I'm asking you to come back, not because I deserve your forgiveness, but because my children need you and because you deserve to know the truth about what happened." And there was silence on the line for a long moment, and then Elena started crying again, but differently this time, and she said she needed time to think, which Marcus understood and respected, because for the first time in a long time, he was willing to wait, willing to let someone else set the pace, willing to trust that the right outcome would emerge if he just stopped trying to control everything. In the weeks that followed, things changed in the Thornton household, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Marcus started coming home earlier, started sitting on the floor During family time, instead of hovering near the edges, started actually listening when Sophie described her elaborate imaginary worlds and when Ethan explained his latest Lego creation, and Duke was no longer just a security measure but a genuine member of the family, sleeping at the foot of Marcus's bed, accompanying him on morning walks, receiving the kind of attention and appreciation he had always deserved. And Elena did come back, not immediately, but eventually, and the dynamic was different now. There was mutual respect, open communication, a willingness on Marcus's part to ask questions before making judgments, and sometimes in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, Marcus would find himself sitting in his office, looking at that frozen frame from the security footage, Duke standing guard, Elena protecting the children, and he would remember the lesson that image had taught him. That loyalty doesn't announce itself, it just shows up when it matters, that the ones who protect us most fiercely are often the ones we overlook, that judgment made in certainty is often judgment made in ignorance, and that sometimes the truth is right in front of us, waiting patiently for us to be humble enough to see it. So I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Have you ever judged someone before you knew the full story? Have you ever been so certain you were right that you didn't bother to look for evidence that you might be wrong? Because I think we all have. I think we've all been Marcus at some point, trusting our assumptions over the people standing right in front of us. And if this story reminded you of the importance of slowing down, of looking deeper, of recognizing loyalty even when it doesn't come in the form you expected, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who believes that loyalty should never be underestimated, because sometimes the real heroes don't ask for recognition, they just do what they were born to do and wait for the rest of us to finally notice.